Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about two-dimensional arrays. Okay, now the arrays you are familiar with are what we call one-dimensional arrays. That's an array that holds data of multiple elements in a single row, just like a single row of boxes on the floor. If you think of a bunch of boxes on the floor, one single row, that's what the kind of array we've been dealing with. Now you may be like, well, what's a two-dimensional array? I don't know what that is. The truth of the matter is you actually do know what a two-dimensional array is. You've been using them pretty much your whole life. Now, in video games and in board games, they often use two-dimensional arrays to represent things like checkers, chess, tic-tac-toe. Maybe you've played Battleship. Okay, maybe you've played a game as a kid called Chutes and Ladders. These games utilize two-dimensional arrays in the shape of a board, of a grid. Okay, if you've ever used an Excel spreadsheet of multiple lines, of multiple rows, if you've used a table like that, you're familiar with what a two-dimensional array is. So a two-dimensional array is more like, instead of a single row of boxes on the floor, we have multiple rows of boxes stacked up on top of each other on the floor. So it's almost like a bunch of one-dimensional arrays, single rows stacked up on top of each other. So that's great. The problem is, we're used to using one-dimensional arrays in C#. We only need to use one index, because remember, in an array, we have to use an index to find out which element in the array we're talking about. Because in an array, we have many different pieces of data held in one single structure. This array is like an apartment building, separated by different apartments. Okay, if we walked into an apartment building, we wouldn't know which apartment to go to unless we had the address, the apartment number. And our index serves as the apartment number. The data in the single array is separated into elements, and the way we get to the element that we want is by using the array index. Now, indexes always start counting at 0, and there's nothing we can do to change that. Okay, but we have here an example of a 6-element array containing color names, and we have the index imagined at the bottom of this row, and you'll see that we would access a particular piece of data or element in the array by using the index number. In this example, I created some code that will create this array. So I declared a string array, used my square brackets. I gave it a name, used my assignment operator, the new constructor keyword, followed by, again, the data type, and then in square brackets, I specified the number of elements that I want. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so 6 elements. And I also went further, and I initialized it with data. In between curly braces, I put the data values, one following the other. So they'll go into their respective boxes in the order that I put them in. Okay, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of data, and there they are. Now, if I want to access, let's say I want to print out the word yellow. I know that yellow is in my 4th element, which happens to have the index of 3. Remember, we start counting at 0. So if I do a console write line statement with the array name followed by square brackets containing the index 3, it's going to get me yellow. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. We're used to that. But if we have an array with multiple rows, a two-dimensional array in this case, it sort of presents us with a little bit of a problem. Let's say I wanted to print out the word brown. Okay, well, let's just say magenta. I wanted to print out the word magenta. Okay, I could use 3. I know that it's in the 3rd column here, but the problem is, which 3rd column? Is it this 3rd column row, or is it that 3rd column row? So we're going to need a different way to sort of access this information. It gets a little more complicated now because we're dealing with another dimension. We had a horizontal dimension, but now we have a vertical dimension. Okay, so again, we have to sort of come up with a different scheme in our program to deal with multi-dimensional array. So if we picture a checker or a chessboard, we can see the arrangement of boxes side by side and up and down. So the boxes are arranged horizontally. Okay, it's kind of we're actually talking about a vertical sort of movement. We have to kind of go vertically up and down to access the rows. But each of these horizontal rows, okay, are stacked, and inside the row we have columns, separate columns. So we need to differentiate the two dimensions, horizontal and vertical, separately as rows and columns, more like vertical and horizontal. So that way we can refer to any particular box inside the structure. So in a checkerboard or chessboard, it's a board with 8 rows of boxes across, and each of these rows contains 8 columns, I guess you could say. So each box represents a column. We have a column now, just not just boxes. In each of these columns, you'll have multiple boxes. So in C#, the addressing scheme, as I mentioned before, is using a square bracket and placing the index number or a variable that contains a number inside of the square brackets. So if I want to find the green x, it's pretty easy in a single dimension array. We just use 6. Okay. Now, if I wanted to find the red x, though, in this situation, then how do I do that? How do I specify it? I need to specify first not just the column it's in, but I also need to specify the row it's in, because, well, which column 2 is it in? Is it in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it in one of these? I mean, which one is it? Okay. I know it's not in the first row. Okay, so I can't just put in 2 or 6 or whatever, because it's not going to be able to give me the information of the other dimension. So to refer to a particular box in a dimension, we're going to need to use 2 indexes. It's a pretty simple solution, one for the horizontal and one for the vertical dimension. So to find the red x here, we simply use 2 indexes inside our square bracket, just like this, 2, comma, 2. The first index indicates the row we want. The second index indicates the column. So by triangulating these, we can come up with the information we want. This is how we find our red x. If I wanted to find our blue plus sign, how would I do that? What would I use? Well, we'd look for the 4th row, so that would be 4, and then we would look for the column 4, so it would be 4, 4. Okay, and again, the indexes are separated by commas inside these square brackets. Now bear with me. This is I just want to show you how to code this. So I have my 2-dimensional array example from before with the colors. Okay, you'll see that we have 2 rows, and there are 6 in total, 6 columns. So the 2D array is declared by specifying a comma inside the square brackets, as I said. Then the number of rows and columns are specified inside the second set of square brackets. Okay, rows come first, separated by a comma. So we're also going to initialize this array by putting each row inside its own set of curly braces. And a comma is going to follow each row's curly braces. So the array that we end up with will have 2 rows, and each row will have 6 columns. So let's take a look at the code. You see that I have, as I had before, I denoted this as a string array, so it's going to contain string data, text. Now take a look at this, at the first set of square brackets. I'm going to put a comma in it, a single comma in this case. The comma is going to tell the compiler that I have an array with more than 1 dimension. So it's going to set it up that way. I'm going to put my array name, could be any name you want, my assignment operator, the new keyword as usual. Again, we're going to indicate the data type as we usually do, and then we're going to indicate first the number of rows, okay, the number of rows in our table, and then the number of columns inside of each row. So if I decide to put data into this here, I am going to use a set of outside curly braces, and then inside those curly braces I'm going to specify each row in its own set of curly braces. Okay, so you see that the first row I have each piece of data separated by commas, in quotes, of course, because it's string. Okay, and then the final orange, there's no comma after it. I end my curly brace, I put a comma, and then I start the next row with a curly brace, put the data in there, you see how it goes, end with a curly brace, and then I end my I put these in between outside curly braces, and then my semicolon. And what that's going to do is create this array, okay, of 2 rows with 6 columns, and put the data in them. Now, to refer to an element, we need to specify, as I said before, both the row and the column inside the square brackets. So let's say I want to write out yellow again. Okay, so as I said, first position is the row, so I'm going to use my console write-line statement, my array name, and in my square brackets I'm going to put the row, in this case it's 0, and then I'm going to put the element, the column number for the element, which is 3, which happens to get me to yellow. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to spend the rest of this video just talking a little bit about using loops with 2-dimensional arrays, because loops, as they work with a single dimension, work really well with a 2-dimensional or multi-dimensional array. The difference is instead of using a single loop, we're going to use a double set of loops. Okay, I'm going to show in the next video. We're going to do a guide lesson, and I'll show you how this works. But let's just talk about it a little bit. So let's take a look at the output here. We actually have a single, we have a 2D array. Okay, each of these numbers represents a piece of data inside the matrix of the array. Now, in my array, this is an integer array. I created an integer array, 2-dimensional. I created an array of 5 rows, 2 columns. So I have 5 rows of 2 columns. And inside each of these, what I did was I used an outside set of curly braces. Here's the start, here's the end. And inside these curly braces, I used a curly brace set or pair for each row. And I put the data inside. 0, 1, which is the first row. And you can see how it was written here. 2, 3 for the second row, 4, 5 for the third row, 6, 7 for the fourth, and 8, 9 for the fifth row. Okay, so I wanted to actually output or write each of these elements to the console. Okay, the problem is that I need to first get to the row. Once I'm in that row, then I need to print out each column inside that row. So I'm going to need an outside loop that's going to get me to each row, and then I'm going to need an inside loop which is going to print out each column. So just really quickly, and we'll go over this in the next video, a little more detail. You'll see that I set up a for loop. This is my outside loop. This is going to get me from one row to the next. So what I did was I set up a loop. I have a counter I set it to 0, and I'm going to make sure as long as counter is less than the number of rows that I have in my loop, this loop's going to keep going. What this outside loop does is it controls an inner loop, another loop, a for loop that's going to have to run inside of this loop. So once I get to my first row, I'm going to then start up my second loop, and it's going to initialize a counter j to 0. It's going to check to make sure as long as the value of j is less than 2, it's going to increment. And what that does, this is where the action writes. You'll see that when I write out my array value, I'm going to use I and j inside my square brackets. Why? Because the loop counters are going to mimic the structure of my 2-dimensional array. So you'll remember that the outside loop is set, first I is 0. Okay, that gets us to the first row. And then our inside loop was set to 0. That gets us to our first column inside of our row. Okay, and so that basically means that I is going to be 0, j is going to be 0. It's going to print out the first number, which is 0. It's going to then go back up, check. Okay, it's going to increment the counter, from 0 to 1. 1 is still less than 2. Okay, so now you still have I is set to 0 still. J is now at 1. So it's going to be 0, 1. It's going to print out the 1. Okay, this one here. It's going to continue to do this, and then once that's done, you're going to break out of this loop, go back up to that loop, and you're going to see how, in our next video, how this is going to work. Okay, so this will then keep going through all of the rows, and eventually you're going to have your whole matrix printed on your console. Okay, see you in the next video.